Hi, welcome to the Cuyahoga County Soldiers and Sailors Monument Podcast, Episode 2. My name is Greg Palumbo. I'm the Executive Director of the monument. And joining me today is Ted Prasse, our President of the Monument Commission. Welcome, Ted.
Thanks, Greg. And thanks to everybody for attending.
Yeah. Can you let us know, what does it mean to be the President of a Monument Commission?
Of course, each one is different, but here in Cuyahoga County, we are a separate political subdivision of the state. We were actually created by state statute back in the 1870s for the purpose of building and then operating the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in downtown Cleveland. So part of Public Square was carved out and given into our control many years ago. And since then, we've had a commission, first of veterans of the Civil War, and since then, primarily composed of veterans whose responsibility is to continue to preserve the monument and to tell the story of the people inside it.
And you are not our first president. There have been several over the years. The first being the men that built the monument, William Gleason.
So, right, and again, he was a veteran of the Civil War, as were the others. In fact, several of those people are remembered inside in statuary. And of course, our architect and sculptor, Levi Schofield, was also a member of that commission. Through the years, there have been many. We do record them and honor them. Most recently, preceding me was Neil Evans, who's unfortunately just passed away, but we do remember Neil for his passion and his dedication. It was Neil's leadership that resulted in the recolorization of the inside of the marble for the monument and really making the changes that helped preserve the fabric of the monument itself. So while we remember him, we also honor him for his hard work.
One of the things we'll focus on today is that beautiful interior that Neil helped to preserve, particularly the statues around the interior base of the monument, the base of the shaft, which creates 4 panels. One of those panels being the beginning of the war in Ohio, and that's our western panel, faces to the west. We'll also talk about the panel that's on the east, the Peacemakers, which depicts Lincoln meeting with his generals at City Point, Virginia, at the wrapping up of the war. So to talk about presidents, so going from presidents to presidents on our monument, let's talk about how many presidents are on our monument and where they're coming from.
So, of course, for these people, we were built in the 1890s, opened in 1894. So we're a generation after the war. So people remembered and had heard stories of most of these people. But our center point, of course, of a couple of our panels is Abraham Lincoln, who was president during the war and led the nation, frankly, to be reunited and to move forward with the end of slavery. He, of course, was assassinated, replaced by his vice president, but the first man elected after the war was another Ohioan, Ulysses S. Grant, from southern Ohio. And that panel that Greg refers to on the east side, we affectionately call it not just the Peacemakers, but why Ohio won the war, because so many of the top leadership in the Union Army came from Ohio.
When we talk about that panel, we have some interesting notables in that panel. Lincoln, of course, being at the center, with Sherman talking about how they're going to wrap up the war. But you also have, just over his shoulder, Robert Todd Lincoln, his son, and behind him, General Grant. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of these other gentlemen that we would see within that panel?
Well, it's kind of fun because some of the names people would know. Sherman is face-to-face with Lincoln, so an Ohioan, William Tecumseh Sherman. As you said, Grant is right behind him holding his cigar. And next to him is Phil Sheridan from New Somerset, Ohio, who is dressed in his typical cavalry sash and cap. And then flanking him is a man who was already dead by this time, but during the Civil War was called the Boy General, and that's George Armstrong Custer from New Rumley. So we have quite a set. Now, interestingly enough, the person who's in the very center, behind Lincoln and Sherman, watching what they're doing, is another original member of the commission who was a lawyer and a doctor from Warren. And so you have these men who knew each other and knew of the people that are represented there. So that was Merritt Leggett, who was commanded a division in Atlanta.
Being public notables, we know that as they were developing these statues and the artists were going about their business, Schofield in particular, they're using photographs for these. So we have photorealistic representations of these gentlemen. Do you think all of them were based off of photos? Do you think there were some that were maybe not as notable?
I think for the most part, these were not only photos, but they were based upon direct firsthand knowledge of many of them. Remember, these were people that they served with. If you think of the way the Army was created right before the war, it's a small group of professional soldiers. And this massive growth, not just in the men who actually were on the line fighting, but the officers who commanded them in the battles and then commanded them further up in terms of the generals. They had to come from somewhere. West Point served both the North and the Southern cause with professional soldiers, but it took a lot more than the 45 that graduated from West Point each year.
And there were a lot of generals in this panel, but there are even more generals on the West panel. So we're going to get a little more in depth with that group. Who are we looking at when we're talking about the beginnings of the war in Ohio and on that Western panel?
Yeah, so war starts, troops are needed, and the troops don't come at first from a national draft. They come from each state producing people. And so the center point is actually a smaller grouping of three. That's the three wartime governors of Ohio. It was those governors in Ohio and the other states, and remember Ohio had the third largest number of troops in the Union cause, that created the organization, just decided who was going to lead. So Denison appoints somebody named George McClellan as the first leader of the Ohio troops, the Ohio Volunteer Infantry, the Ohio Volunteer Artillery. And so McClellan, who becomes a well-known Civil War general, actually gets his start because of that Ohio connection.
So there are three wartime governors. Why three? The war was 1861 to 65. We're talking about 4 years.
Yeah, we're used to thinking about 4-year terms, but back then you had the tag end of one term, a new man came in, and then another one. So shorter terms means more turnover.
Right.
And health issues, of course, are also play into it sometimes. And you'll find their names still sometimes because camps and things like that, so they'll show up in the records. But what's interesting about that panel on the west side is less the wartime governors and more the two groupings on either side of them, because each of them also include an Ohio president.
Let's talk a little bit about those Ohio presidents. We often, as we talk to people and they're coming into the monument, will talk about first the panel about the ladies of the Sanitary Commission, precursor of the American Red Cross, and the first panel you see as you enter the door. But to get people to turn around the corner, we mentioned Lucy Hayes and how she would become First Lady when her husband, Rutherford B. Hayes, would become president. And we'd take him right around the corner to where we see Rutherford B. Hayes. Can you tell us a little bit about Hayes and the men that are flanking him?
Sure, and let's put it in a little bit of context in the sense that we had 5 Ohioans who wore the Union blue who became president. So if you think about it, from Grant in 1868 through McKinley, there was only one other man who was elected who wasn't from Ohio during that whole window of time. So unfortunately, 2 of those men died in office. 4 of Ohio's 8 presidents died in office, so the odds aren't that good for them. But you get Grant, who we spoke about. He's immediately followed in 1876 by Rutherford B. Hayes from Fremont, Ohio. And he then is followed by James Garfield from Mentor, born in Moreland, what is now Moreland Hills. Again, 3 presidents in a row from Ohio. So Hayes is there. Interestingly enough, Hayes was a fighter, and he was actually badly wounded just before Antietam. And the story of Lucy is how she finds him as he's recovering, and then from that cares for the other members of the regiment. So Rutherford B. Hayes, also known as Rudd, was an interesting individual who had connections with Northeast Ohio. In fact, what is now the Western Reserve Historical Society is an organization that he took pride in being involved with. And of course, after he was president of the United States, he became president of what is now the Ohio History Connection, that board. So he was involved in the community as well. And we do know that he was involved with the men who built this monument, because among the legal difficulties in getting it built, once the Monument Commission succeeded before the Ohio Supreme Court, Hayes wrote a letter that said something to the effect of, "That's great that you've won. Now that you've won the issue, try and find a resolution that's acceptable to everybody." So
That's good. A little prodding from the president never hurts. The panel goes on to show some other generals beyond the 2 presidents. There are a couple of men of note in there, not necessarily all Ohioans.
all but one. All but one. So with Hayes, he's surrounded by 2 Ohioans, William Rosecrans and Quincy Gilmore, both West Pointers. So not what's called political or civilian generals, but rather professionals. Both engineers at one point, as many top graduates from West Point were. Yet both perhaps considered not as successful, not in positions, primary leadership positions by the end of the war. So Rosecrans leads an army that's defeated at Chickamauga, and Sherman replaces him. Gilmore is down in the South, leads the Department of the South. He actually commanded the battles at Fort Wagner, which resulted in the use of the 54th Massachusetts in the assault, which we've seen in the movie Glory.
Both men fairly successful after the war, correct?
Both successful after the war. Rosecrans was a Democrat. He ended up being a congressman at one point. And Gilmore was really kind of an engineer type and went on.
Yeah, successful in New York, I believe.
That's right. That's right. He was born in Lorraine, what is now Lorraine. And so and by the way, it's Quincy is how it should be pronounced. He was named after James Quincy Adams.
Okay.
As opposed to, we think of it as Quincy with a C, but it would have been pronounced Quincy at that time.
And then as we shift to the other side of the panel, we're looking at Garfield, and
Garfield is almost face to face, or right next to, a man named Jacob Dolson Cox. And then Cox is, on the other side of Cox is McClellan, who we talked about briefly. So Cox was one of the most successful generals below that first tier we talked about, the Grants, Shermans, and Sheridans. Cox led a very successful division, the Kanawha Division, under McClellan, early in the war, when West Virginia was still part of Virginia. And so they managed to defeat the Confederates' attempts to hold on to what is now West Virginia, and then moved to the east for the Battle of Antietam in South Mountain. And so there he actually commanded the Kanawha Division. One of the regiments making up that division was the 23rd Ohio, which is the home of both Rudd Hayes and William McKinley. So the regiment of presidents, that group of less than 1,000 men, had 2 future presidents within that small group. Cox then took over, at that battle, took over a corps when the corps commander was killed, the first corps commander killed during the war at South Mountain, Reno. So Cox goes on, he becomes a very well-respected general, not rising to the top command, but at least at 2 of the battles commanded significant troops, both at Antietam and then later during the war at the Battle of Nashville, where there's the Battle of Franklin outside of Nashville, I'm sorry. And at Franklin, the command of the army in the field is actually somebody else, but he's north of the river. And so Cox is the commander, quote, on the line. And Cox is an interesting character because he wasn't a professional military man. In fact, he was a lawyer. And he's a graduate of Oberlin College. He married the daughter of the president of Oberlin. Considered he was going to be a religious man.
Yeah.
At one point, he was studying to be a divinity.
Right.
School.
Had a falling out with his father-in-law, which pushed him away from that pursuit. In a ideological difference, very academically.
Yeah, so you're right, Greg. Cox was, he was one of those guys, you might consider a Renaissance man, right? So involved as he is in the law, he's also an abolitionist. And we should take a lot of pride, particularly in Northeast Ohio, right? Ohio is a spot where we can claim places like Oberlin College, admitting blacks and women to study there and to create and support this groundswell of abolition. Ohio as a state has never allowed slavery. And of course it's the home of John Brown, who's probably the most famous man who decided that rebellion was the answer against the Constitution at the time, which of course allowed for slavery.
And of course, not all that glitters is gold. The last escaped slave trial held here in Cleveland.
Because Ohio settled really from different parts of the country.
Right.
And when you do that, you bring with you your beliefs, your understandings, your practices. And so to a large degree, Northern Ohio gets settled out of New England. Southern Ohio gets settled out of Virginia. And then we also have people that come up from Kentucky and Tennessee. And so there's this intermingling of beliefs. You talked briefly about, the last fugitive slave issue. Yet some of the men we honor in the monument are those that represented the fugitive slaves in the argument that once in a free soil, you should remain free.
Right.
We also have this fascinating, reality, right? That Ohio also claims a town that Wellington, Ohio, in which they took fugitive slave catchers and, in essence, stopped them from what they were doing. So this was not an easy time, right? We think of the Civil War starting with the election of Lincoln, but we had decades before that.
Right. And it really, as you were talking about
we're digressing a lot.
We are digressing. But as you're talking about the settling of Ohio, that's why we become this microcosm of the United States. And bringing birthplace of presidents, because we're now representing the ideology of the entire nation within this microcosm. So if you can win Ohio and you can be successful as a politician in Ohio, you have to kind of walk both sides of that line. One of those men...
Let's bring it back to Cox.
Being Cox, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Cox...
Let's talk a little bit about him both. So he finishes the war and becomes governor of Ohio.
Right.
But he only serves one term because he's unhappy
with having to back off of his principles. And I believe he also served in Grant's cabinet. So I think he had a short tour in Grant's cabinet. He was friends with Hayes and very close friends with Garfield, supported each of them. But he was also part of a group called the Liberal Republicans that began to separate what was happening based upon the Reconstruction push.
Yeah, he's himself is in favor of African American suffrage, particularly in Ohio. However, as he gets into Reconstruction, he's siding with the groups that don't feel that that suffrage is yet warranted for African Americans in.
I think it was more nuanced, because there were many who didn't think it would work, and he was probably one of them. He actually had at least floated an idea that create a separate section of the South, carve it and create it as a primarily black governed area. And it sounds horrible today, but yet part of what he was working off of is what Sherman had done, where he had taken and settled fugitive slaves into former plantations in the coastal South. The 40 acres and a mule that had been promised to people. And so you had, it's the challenge, right? Abolition says freedom, but it doesn't speak to what voting rights are, as we've talked about. It doesn't speak to who gets to own what. It doesn't speak to who gets to sit on a jury.
Issues that we deal with today, as far as generational wealth, and you're starting a large population of people at zero, and they're already behind all of those.
Frederick Douglass, I think, said it well. He said, "Give me the 3 boxes, right? The cartridge box, let me fight. The ballot box, let me vote. And the jury box, let me decide what the laws mean." And so I think that's what much of the time since then. So Cox was an exemplar of that conflict. And in fact, because of those feelings, he pulled himself back, I think, and recognized, and went more into what we today would certainly call public service, but was less so. I mean,
he becomes the Secretary of the Interior under Grant, and serves in his cabinet for a while as a reform candidate, as a reformer of public office, to try and change civil service to be more of the service side of things.
Political appointments drove sort of election policy for everybody, both parties through the time, right? But Cox was a real leader in let's base it on merit, and I think that was one of his disappointments with Hayes, who believed in it but didn't make it as high a priority. Garfield, who again believed in it but hadn't yet had a chance to do anything, and of course much of the civil service reform comes out of the death of Garfield, because his assassin is seen as someone who's trying to claim a patronage job.
Right. Some of the things that Cox tried to institute was institutional testing and merit-based performance rewards. So if he's really setting up this civil service as a career, so that your lower level civil servants can continue to function from administration to administration, because they're basing their appointments on merit rather than on who they know.
And to do the work of the country, right? So that it's hard when you put it down and somebody new picks it up every 4 years.
He also tried to institute a 30-day vacation rule that limited your vacation time to a certain amount of time. The problem with that is that you used to be able to campaign as a public official, that you used to go and take a month or two off to go campaigning every year, and this was seen as just the way that work happened. So you would leave and go do your thing and come back whenever you were done campaigning. Cox didn't feel that that should be a given, and that if you wanted to go and campaign, you had 30 days of vacation time you could take and go and do the campaigning and then come back, but that wasn't enough for the cycle that they needed. So this ends up getting blown up by President Grant, and this becomes kind of the rub point between him and Cox.
And one of the things we see about Cox is time and time again, if he doesn't agree with it, he walks away from it. And that's really defines his public career to a large measure. He then gets into actually being a law professor and heading up Cincinnati Law School, and then becomes president of the University of Cincinnati.
Yeah, when they merged with the College of Cincinnati. Being a Bearcat myself, I'm very proud of our President Cox. He did a great job during that merger and as the university started to grow, holding that position for a while, and then he continued on to continue practicing law as well as teaching law as well.
Yeah, and he ultimately, and he needed, like everybody else, right? He had to take care of his family, and so this was about, can I raise enough money? What am I going to earn? How do I do this? And then when the two law schools end up merging, he ends up not getting the job as dean anymore.
Right.
So he starts to look at what he's going to do in retirement and where they're going to go. And he embarks on a whole new career, and that is he becomes a historian of the Civil War. As we talked about, he certainly was directly involved in the Civil War, but he becomes the best respected of that first generation of historians, I think, about the war itself. And when I say that first generation, I mean the people that actually served. So they were telling the story often from their own perspective. One of the interesting things in the monument itself is Cox is in this relief. Directly above him is a man named Emerson Opdyke. And I talked about how Cox commanded it on the line at the Battle of Franklin. One of the heroes of that battle was a man named Emerson Opdyke, who led his Tigers to defeat the Confederates as they started to break the line. And he and Opdyke and Cox were friends, but the dispute as to who was most responsible for this battle became a dispute of writings over time. And so the two of them didn't end up as close friends anymore. Despite that, Schofield decided he would put the two of them in close juxtaposition. So it's an interesting choice.
It is, perhaps continuing that debate.
So part of what I brought, Greg, is a couple of the books that he wrote. So not only did he write books, this happens to be the Battle of Atlanta and the March to the Sea, Franklin and Nashville. So I'm going to digress for a second. We all know about Sherman's march to the sea. But as he marched many troops to the sea, others went back to protect the North against the Confederates under Hood. And as Hood brought that army to the west and north, the battles of Franklin and Nashville defeated that Confederate army under Hood. We don't hear as much about that because Sherman was busy moving people to Savannah and then north. So not only did Cox write extensively, but he also reviewed many, many books. So he's very well known. If you could have Cox write your review of your history, you were likely to get a good play of that review, which of course publicized not just your book you were trying to sell, but of course your viewpoint, the story that you were trying to tell in your history.
Yeah.
So one of the fun things about Cox, of course, is when he decides to retire, ultimately, life comes full circle, and he and his wife go back to Oberlin. And he's able to do that because he had invested money through a man named Charles Gates Dawes. And Dawes, for those of you who don't remember this, was the son of another Civil War hero named Rufus Dawes. Charles Gates Dawes becomes Vice President of the United States, was a strong supporter of McKinley, becomes Vice President of the United States under Coolidge, and wins the Nobel Peace Prize for the work he did between the two world wars.
Coolidge nominated in Cleveland, Ohio at the National Convention held at Public Hall, the first convention ever to be broadcast on radio.
Yeah, and they do say, by the way, that just as Kennedy's presence on TV helped a great deal, Coolidge's soft voice was picked up well by radio. So he wasn't a great public speaker, but the radio allowed him to come through.
And it's interesting because Quiet Cal didn't come to Cleveland for the convention. He listened to it over radio in Washington, D.C. As he was continuing to serve out the rest of that term. The radio could be listened to by a radio truck on Public Square by the crowds who would have been
Interesting.
out on our quadrant.
And of course, Silent Cal was a well-trained debater. So you have these very interesting conundrums that we,
So, getting back to the panel at large, we'll talk about Garfield a little bit more in another podcast, but Garfield, included next to Cox, and McClellan, our only non-Ohioan on that panel. Why include McClellan and Garfield with Cox, do you think?
Well, I think those are probably choices. There's the negative. McClellan is no longer in national leadership by the end of the war. So it doesn't make sense to put him on the other side. Of course, he'd been replaced, and what's more, he ran against Lincoln in 1864 and was defeated. But when he commanded the Ohio troops in western Virginia, Cox was the man who replaced him then, when McClellan was called to Washington by Lincoln. So Cox and McClellan had that close professional relationship. Garfield and Cox had a close personal relationship and a political relationship that continued, well, pre, during, and post-war. And of course, Garfield was another fascinating character. I look forward to when we talk about him some more, right?
Yeah.
A pacifist who becomes a military leader.
All of these men have a lasting legacy, particularly in Ohio. Even though Cox moves away from these positions, and even with leaving the Grant administration, Grant still institutes a civil service commission that would help to reform our national civil service corps. However, in a little bit of a stinging, maybe a on your way out the door kind of thing, leaves out the Department of the Interior from that commission oversight because they say that it's too large and can't be managed under the Civil Service Commission, and Grant appoints his cousin to the post formerly held by Cox. So no love lost there, I don't think. As we finish out the panel, there are reliefs on either side that show men signing up for the war, and then on the other side marching off to war. It's called the beginning of the war in Ohio. As we've talked about, it encompasses quite a bit of Ohio history. Even though it's the beginning, it's really all of the Ohio history wrapped into this panel. But most importantly on the entire panel are those men that are signing up and marching off, as those are the 9,000 men we would see listed on our walls throughout the monument. I want to thank you, Ted, for joining me today, and thank everyone else for joining us. We will be talking about those 9,000 stories through this podcast series, as well as the promised Garfield discussion as well, and many more.
Let's not forget about Red Hayes.
And Hayes. Thank you very much for talking with us today about our two East and West panels and in the birthplace of presidents. We welcome you to please come down to the monument. We're open weekdays. Please check our website for times.
We look forward to your coming.